chapter 18, and we'll continue. There is a previous video that discussed the use of components, JText field and JText area. This video builds on the other one, and we start from Layout Manager. So we mentioned that there are three major pieces in building a graphical user interface. The first one is figuring out which components you want to use to represent your interface. The second piece is how do you want to lay out the components. And then the third piece, what events do you want to support in building that component. The layout management talks about the laying out the component on the frame. So the bottom line is that there is a frame in desktop application. There is a frame, and on that frame you lay out these different components. So in order for the frame to support all the different components you want, the frames come with what we call the layout manager, which is an invisible piece that allow you to manage how layouts are being handled. There are some standard library layout managers that we will cover some of them here. There are some more, and there might be some more complex layout managers, and you may build your own layout manager if you want. A layout manager handles things like where every component will sit on the frame relative to the other, how to handle when the user minimize a frame, maximize a frame, or resize a frame, how the components move relative to one another, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of actually work that need to happen to support the different situations. And so for your purpose, you want to take a look at the existing layout managers and use one of them. And if you want to build a complex user interface, use panels to group different components together, because panel, as we mentioned in previous video, panels acts like a frame, and you can have a panel and you can have the panel and have its own layout, and then you put panels inside panels and panels inside panels, and then on the frame. So you can have the effect of complex layouts by using panels. Okay, so each container, like a frame or a panel, has layout manager that directs the arrangement of the components. As you may remember, a long time ago, the JFrame by default has something called border layout manager. This is the default layout manager for a frame, and there are a couple of others that are common: the flow layout and the grid layout. The JPanel has by default the flow layout, and we will talk in a minute about what's the difference between each one of those layouts. You can set a layout manager. You create a layout manager by creating an object of any of these classes: border layout, flow layout, and grid layout. And then you add that object to the method setLayout. So if you want to change the default layouts, if you want to use the default layouts, you don't have to do anything. So on a frame, it's a border layout. On a panel, it's a flow layout. If that's what you want, then you don't have to do anything. But if you want on a frame to change from the default, which is a border layout, to a grid layout, for instance, or on the panel to change from the default that's a flow layout to a border layout, then you need to call this method setLayout and pass that method an object of a layout object. So what is the border layout? The border layout divides the container into 5 regions: north, south, east, west, and center. Notice that the north occupies the entire top, the south occupies the entire bottom of the frame, the west is the west filling in between, so the west does not extend to the top and bottom as long as there's a north and south, and east is the same thing, and then you have center. Now, the border layout, as we said, this is the default of the JFrame. When you add components to a border layout, you need to specify which region you want the component to go to. If you don't specify, by default it's added to the center. So all the examples we had so far, we never really specified the layout. So all the layouts that we add, all the components we added to the frame were added to the center region. If you don't have any components in north, south, east, or west, the center region expands to fill all of those other 4 regions. Alright, so the frame is always occupied. When adding a component, you can specify the position by calling on a constant variable with the region name in the border layout class. So this is a constant static variable. This is why you can access it from the class name directly. So when you add a component, you add it and then you add another parameter, pass another parameter that has the region that you want to add the region of the border layout. The grid layout is sets a grid, meaning rows and columns of equally spaced cells. The rows and columns, the grid layout's advantage, it takes the frame and divide the frame into equal size cells and based on rows and columns. So if you say I want 3 rows and 4 rows and 3 columns, so these are rows. So this grid layout has 3 columns and 4 rows. When you add components to the grid layout, the first component, you can't specify which cell the component go to. So you can't say I want to add a component to this cell or I want to add a component to that cell. Components are added automatically to the top left cell, then the one next to it, the one next to it, and then keep going, filling the grid by the order you add the components from the top left and moving row by row. So see here, you create a grid layout of 4 by 3 and you add the components 7, 8, 9 and then 4, which adds the top left first row, then the second row. Notice in the creating the grid layout object, since I don't really care about the name of that object, we're using something we call anonymous object, which is you use only the new operator followed by the call to the constructor to initialize the object in memory and pass a reference to that object to the method. The method receives that object in a method parameter, so the method knows where the object is in memory. But our class here will not know. We don't know where is the memory location that has the grid layout because we did not assign this into a variable as we did, for instance, with the JPanel over here. So here is how the grid layout. There's something called the grid bag layout. The grid layout too, you can specify the distance between the cells, horizontal and vertical. The grid bag layout, tabular arrangement of components. The difference between grid bag and grid is in the grid bag you can have columns with different size and you can have components that span multiple columns. So this is complex. It gives you a lot of flexibility and it is not covered in the book, but you can look up the API documentation and see how this one works. Did we miss the flow layout? I think I missed the flow layout. The flow layout adds the components from the left to the right add components left to the right, and it adjusts based on the size. So if there is enough size, components will fill a row. If the frame size comes narrower, then it will go to the next line and have some flexibility. So it doesn't, the grid layout, if you say I want 3 columns and 4 rows, regardless of how you resize your container, it's going to always stay 3 rows and 3 columns. In a flow layout, it will wrap the cells. So if you resize less than what is enough to carry 3 cells or 3 components, then this 9 you will find it come to the second line here. That's what the flow layout, it flows with the resizing. The nested panel, you can create a panel inside a panel, and the example you have here is to building a GUI for an ATM, where you have a JText field in north, which is in a north position, and J panel with a grid layout in the center position. So this kind of drawing and identifying what components you're going to have and how are you going to lay them out on the frame is important design consideration for you to do. And as the scene in front of you here, this is actually something you draw, whether you draw it by hand or you get a drawing software and draw how you want this user interface to be designed. There is a class later on in the curriculum called the human-computer interaction, where you really spend the entire semester doing user interface design and using different components. It's a very fun class to take. This is an example of how you make choices. So the example goes through building this program which has a text, and you can change the font of the text using JComboBox, and you can change the style by using checkboxes, and changing the size by using radio buttons. And along the way, it introduces how to use JComboBox, which give you a drop-down list of options, and checkboxes, which give you the opportunity to check a box or an option, and radio button. The difference between a radio button and a checkbox: radio button, you select only one of the group at a time. A checkbox, you can have more than one selected. So here is a description of the radio button. A radio button are object of class JRadioButton. You create the button with the name, and you need to add the radio buttons in a group. So you create a button group from the type button group object, and you add the radio buttons to the group. The group is the one that manages that one of the button is selected or not. You can call on the button to know if the button is selected by calling the method is selected. So you say if the large button, which is this one that you created, it's an object, so you call on the object and you call method is selected. And if the method is selected, you specify the size that is large. You can also, if you want to set a radio button from code, you can call the method setSelected. You can place a border around a panel, which give you that feeling here. You see how this is a panel. You can, where you have the small, medium, and large, you can have a border around the panel, which will give you also a heading for that border. And you use that by creating you can create an etched border which will not have a title, or you create a titled border. Here we're using anonymous classes to create a titled border that wraps the etched border object with the title size, and then you set the border for the panel to the object that got created here. If you don't feel comfortable using those anonymous objects, then you can just add another line, assignment line, similar to saying jpanel panel equal new jpanel. You say etched border, you give it whatever name, maybe the border size or the size border equal new etched border, and then you come and say title border something equal new title border of the etched border and the size. Checkboxes has two states, if the checkbox is checked or unchecked. And ComboBox give you a list of choices. Text field displays the name of the current selection of the combo box. You can make a combo box editable, meaning that the user can add their own selection and it gets added to the items. You can add strings to the combo box by calling the add item method. So you create the combo box object and use the add item to add items to the combo box. And you can always get which item got selected by the user by calling the get selected item. You can also set an item selected, maybe in the load or something, by calling set selected item. Then it goes the layout. So how are you going to do the layout? So here is a design. So you use a label in the center position, and then you have a panel of a grid layout in the south position that has one column and 3 rows. The first row has a combo box, the second row has a panel of checkboxes, the third row has a panel of option boxes. So this is how you decide on the layout. Then you need to say, okay, so what kind of event we're going to respond to. So the checkboxes and the radio button and the combo box, they all generate an action event when the user makes a selection. So if the user click on here or click on here or click on here, it generates an action event. One thing you can do, since you have 5 different components, all of them generate the same event, you can create only one listener, and which will implement the action listener interface. And in the action perform method, you readjust. In this example, you apply the font style and size selection to the font that we have over here. This is a drawing of all the classes that exist. Font viewer, this is a class that you create. Font viewer frame, this is the class that extends JFrame and creates the font viewer frame with the main method. And these are classes from the library that we use. Here is the implementation. The main method creates a font viewer frame and makes it visible. And the font viewer frame extends JFrame, creates the different components in the constructor, creates the label, add it to the center, and then create a choice listener which implements an action listener for all the listeners, and then the action performed. And in the action form, this is an advantage of using inner classes, because when you use an inner class, you have access to all the methods of the class, so you don't have to worry about passing data and so on. So in this method, we're calling a method called setSampleFont, and then you add the listener to you create an object of the listener, and then in the create control panel, that's when you add the listener. So this is why the listener, the action listener here, is created as a class variable, so it can be available to multiple methods. The create control panel has the 3 panels, and it creates the control, set the layout to 3 and 1, and then add the 3 panels, and then and add it to the frame in the south. Then each one of the combo box, here is this one, and adds it to the panel, and so on for the checkbox, and so on for the radio button. And dividing this into methods like that is for organization. The sample font is where you get access to what was selected. So you get a string of the font name by calling get selected item. Notice that we cast that into a string. Then you check if the italic is selected. Then you add, so there is a style is 0, and then you add the italic, which is a constant in the font class, and then the bold, because you want to, the user can select both, and then you, based on the size, you set like sample values for the size, and then you check if one of the buttons selected, you set the size, and then you create a font from the name, the style, and the size, and you set the font for the label, and you will repaint, or for the frame, and then you repaint. Alright, so I'm going to stop here and end this video, and we will continue at another video to end this chapter.